Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my NACL Week 5 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Really interesting week in the NACL. Only 2 weeks remain this week and the next week, and then we are getting into playoffs, and so we're really getting right around the time where we're figuring out what all of these teams are going to look like moving into the rest of the split. Some teams are surging right now, some teams are collapsing right now, and a lot of teams are somewhere in the middle, so a lot of interesting things, to talk about when it comes to this week, but let me know you guys' thoughts and opinions down in the comments section below. We're not going to agree on everything, so I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on what teams you're enjoying right now, what teams you think are looking good, and what teams you think are looking bad down below. Of course, conversation pieces are great. Don't just scream at me that I'm doing your favorite team dirty in this series. I try to be as unbiased as possible when I go over this analysis, and so let me know what you guys' thoughts are down below. But what we're going to do in this video, if you are new, is go over all 3 days of NACL action. We'll be putting up a little scoreboard on the screen to go over all of the days individually, and I'll be going through all of the series, talking about a player of the series, a dud of the series, and just the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. And then at the end of the week, I'll be giving you my updated power rankings, as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, starting off with day number 1, and we kick day 1 off in our first group of series here with the matchup between Team Fish Taco and Wildcard Gaming that ended up being a 1-1 split. Both of these teams have been pretty good. Wildcard has been really good over the course of this split, much better than I was expecting. I didn't think they were going to be a bad team, but they've legitimately been one of the best teams in the NACL, and I don't think a lot of people saw that coming. The top side of their map, I think, has really unlocked so much for how this team likes to play, and that was definitely the case again in this series. There were a couple players that I definitely want to talk about, but Taco definitely held their own, and that win in game number 2 was really fun to watch. Even though they kind of got blown back in game 1, game 2 was a blast and a super fun game that you can attribute basically not all, but mostly to one player just playing out of his mind. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Starting, of course, with wildcard player of the series for me is going to go to Zamudo in the top lane. This was actually kind of a difficult decision because I think Saligo in particular also played phenomenal for wildcard. Both of the solo laners really stepping up. And when I talk about top side of the map for wildcard, I'm talking about Zamudo, I'm talking about Keel, I'm talking about Saligo. They are the 3 players that have really stepped up for wildcard. Not that Lens and Dombre have been bad by any means. I think they've been fine. They've just kind of been weak side for the most part. Zamudo's gotten a lot of resources for this team, and Keel in particular really likes to dominate a lot of games. And I think Zamudo has really gotten better in the recent weeks. He was somebody who I was starting to get a little bit concerned about, and he still is a little bit of a feast or famine player, but it's been a lot more feasting as of the last couple of series, and this was a great example of that. Going into a player like Lunacia that can be pretty hit or miss, it was good to see Zamudo hit a little bit more in this one, but Saligo was also really good. He's the other player that you have to shout out. In my opinion, he was the most consistent player. I think Zamudo was the player who popped the most in this series, and so for me, he ends up getting the player of the series for that. But I think when you look at consistency and just like overall positive plays, Saligo was right up there, if not number 1 in this series for the amount of plays that he was able to make. He's just so consistent. Like, I know a lot of people don't like veterans or, especially in the mid lane in the NACL with all of the newcomers that have been coming up, especially to the LCS level and performing well, but I think Saligo has more than earned his spot here in the NACL. He's been phenomenal over the course of this entire split, legitimately one of probably the top 2 or 3 mid laners in the NACL across this year so far, and so good stuff from him. The rest of the team was also good. Lens and Dombre, I think, were really solid. Keel is always relatively efficient. Even if there were some questionable plays towards the back half of game number 2, it still was, for the most part, fine, but Taco was able to take that game number 2, and they looked okay doing it. Honestly, you gotta give so much credit to Spawn, who just continues to be a massive positive force for this team. I hate to say that my breakdown of them in the pre-split process was almost entirely accurate, but it honestly was almost entirely accurate. The only thing that I got wrong was that NXI was going to be this feast or famine, and we'll get to him in a minute, but Spawn being this team's like major player, I think is really good to see. Spawn is a very good player at this level. He is arguably the best team fighter in the NACL. I think you could absolutely have that conversation, and he's going to be able to get to that game and keep teams alive and be able to win a lot of fights if you give him the opportunity and the resources, and he was able to do that in game 2. So really great series, I would say, overall from him. Really great game 2, but the rest of the team unfortunately didn't impress me nearly as much. Dud of the series is going to go to NXI in the support position. This has kind of been bubbling for a little while now. He's been kind of shouted out as somebody who's been a little bit more of a negative for this Taco team over the past week and a half or so, and I think this was just kind of an encapsulation of that. Not a great series from him. And then Onat in the mid lane, it just felt like Saligo was significantly more active on the map and was creating a lot more pressure than him. He wasn't particularly awful, but just something worth noting. And so overall, I would definitely say Wildcard walks out of this looking at least a little bit better, but congrats to Taco for being able to take that game, and congrats to Spawn. I think he looked great, but Wildcard still is a team that you absolutely have to look out for. They're going to feel a little bit hard done that they couldn't 2-0 this series, but at the end of the day, at least they were able to pick up a win. And then moving on to our second of the first slate of games here, we had probably the most interesting matchup of day one with the Cincinnati Fear taking on Team Liquid Challengers. And this was a 1-1 split. Really good for Fear here. Team Liquid's looked a little bit more mortal in recent weeks than they did at the beginning of the split. They looked pretty untouchable for the first 3 weeks. First half of the split, it felt like nobody was really ever going to be on the same level as TLC. But Fear looking really good in recent weeks. I think underratedly very good in recent weeks. A couple of their players I think have just been phenomenal. And I think that continued in this series. A lot of the players that we've pointed out continued to be really good. And I think you could make the case that they looked better in this series than Team Liquid, which is just a really good sign. Player of the series for me was actually a super difficult decision because two players on Fear, in my opinion, were super eye-catching and super good. I'm going to give it to JJ in the support position because, God, he was everywhere on that rel in particular. He was just making so much happen in game number one that, to me, it was just the most noticeable of him being able to create an impact on the map. A lot of great engages, a lot of really good frontlining done. JJ's been, up and down, I would say, over this split, but has secretly been, pretty good for this team. And the player who was also in contention for this that has not secretly been very good, but just very good, was Shochi in the mid lane. He's just been phenomenal. He's been able to go up against almost anybody in the league and just kind of be able to beat them. And in this one, he went into an actual LCS mid laner in Harry, who's obviously down now with APA moving up to the main roster. Harry was playing here for TLC, and Shochi was the better mid laner in this series, which is super impressive. It just goes to show you where he's at right now. I think, I've been talking about him all split as somebody who could make that jump up to LCS and be relatively competent along the lines of a player like APA or, Spyrax, that we'll get into in a little bit. But I think Shochi's right in that conversation as well. And he's been phenomenal for this team this split. He's not going to get nearly as many MVP votes as he probably should, but he definitely at least deserves to be in the conversation. So JJ, Shochi, definitely the stand-up members, but Perry also had a really good series. I think Mir also had a really good series on the other side. I think both junglers were active and trying to make a lot of plays happen, and I don't really want to disparage either of them, but Shochi and JJ were definitely the standout members for Fear. But for Team Liquid, I'm not going to say that I'm starting to get concerned, because I think that would be an unfair statement to make, because I'm really not concerned, right? I still think that they're one of the better teams in the league, and they've performed like it. Being able to take a game off of Fear at the very least puts them in the top 4. And so that's pretty good, right? Because Fear is a very good team. But this is not the dominant, I'm absolutely going to steamroll you team that they kind of were for the first half of the split. They are a little bit more, like I said earlier, mortal now. And I think that is at least a little bit concerning for a few people. My dud of the series is going to go to Kim Down. I think in particular, this bot lane has been less aggressive in the early game, and that's been something to note, that the rest of the map isn't quite winning as hard as they were in previous weeks. And I think that has kind of taken itself out on the bot lane, who I don't want to say was just benefiting off of that because they were playing well, but they've been significantly less, I think, than what they were at the beginning of the split over the last couple of weeks. And I think it's been very noticeable to see. Kim Down in particular, I think, just hasn't functioned as well on the engagers as he did earlier. I don't know if that's just because the rest of the team's not following up in the same way, or if they have to go into a lot of these mid games, with a neutral gold or a gold deficit kind of experience, but JJ was just significantly better across this entire series. That game one from Kim Down was actually just really bad, and he was very inactive on the map. When you're last in your team in KP percentage as a support, that's just not very good, you know what I mean? It's not a very good thing to see. So Kim Down's gonna get done of the series. I still like Team Liquid, but there are question marks for this team. I like what Mir was able to do in the series. I still think he's arguably the best jungler in the NACL. His pathing is just absolutely nuts. But the rest of this team's got to be able to step up, and Harry coming in and just kind of being okay in the first series, that's concerning. And there's definitely things to look out for there. So we'll end up seeing what ends up happening with Team Liquid, but really nice series from Fear. They just continue to overperform expectations. And if this is a team that makes a miraculous top 3, top 2 run in playoffs, I don't think I'm going to be surprised at all. And then moving on to our second slate of games here on day number 1, we got to kick off that slate with Maryville University taking on Disguised, and DSG is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 win, as they absolutely should here. This team has looked significantly more consistent in the past, like, 3 or 4 series, which is really good to see. That's kind of all we've really asked them to be. Over the course of this split, they were randomly dropping games to a lot of teams in the league, teams that they absolutely should have been beating 2-0, or just kind of dominating. They were dropping random games here or there. They were still able to pick up, 1-1s a lot throughout the split, but we really wanted to see more of the dominant force come out from DSG, because this is a team that realistically should be in the top 2 without really a lot of questions. And so for them to be able to play a team in Maryville that looked really good at the start of the split, has kind of fallen off a bit as we've gotten towards the back half, I think is really, really good. For them to look as good as they did here, I think is really, really solid. But a lot of the improvement for me when it comes to DSG, and the reason that this consistency has jumped up so much, is because I think the bot lane is just playing so much better than they were over the middle part of the split. My player of the series is going to go to Meech in the bot lane, and he's been phenomenal over the past 3 or 4 series. I've been critical of Meech basically over the entirety of his NACL and Academy career for being inconsistent, for being somebody who is so ridiculously talented. He's going to have games that are just super good, and he's going to have some games that are super bad, because he's going to be aggressive, he's going to overextend sometimes in a position where he doesn't necessarily need to, and that can cause problems for the team. I know this is kind of a weird comparison, but for those of you who watch the LPL or watch my LPL videos, it reminds me a ton of how I talk about Abel on OMG over in the LPL, where it's like, man, the good games are so good. Like, they're almost better than anybody else in the entire league, and for Meech, I absolutely agree with that. Like, at his best, he's the best AD carry in the NACL, but at his worst, he's like 6th or 7th, like, you're just gonna get games like that sometimes, and luckily, I think he's really, really, like, grown up the consistency in recent weeks. There's been so much more of the good than the bad, and I think that's really been a positive, and kind of why DSG has been able to succeed as much as they have. So credit to Meech, he was really good. Zazel's obviously been fantastic in that same vein. I think the bot lane has to be kind of coordinated in general for Meech to be able to play at that level, and they absolutely were in this series. They were just straight up better than Maryville. Not that that's entirely surprising, but definitely worth pointing out. Tomio was great. Fake God was awesome on the top side of the map. He's been the best top laner in the NACL. DSG just looked really good. We've wanted to see more dominant performances coming out from this team and coming out from these players, and I think in this series we absolutely got it. And then for Maryville on the other side, I just don't know what to think about this team, because they were so good over the middle of the split, right? Like, after week 1, we all wrote them off. We were like, they're bad, they're not talent-wise able to go up with a lot of the other teams in the NACL that have some of these more, experienced players, and then they were really good over the middle part of the split, taking games off of some of the better teams, being able to consistently beat the bottom-tier teams. Like, they very convincingly looked like a middle-tier team in the league, which was great. That's exactly what you wanted to see from Maryville, and now it feels like they're kind of back on the downward trajectory, and that's kind of frustrating. They haven't been nearly as dominant in recent weeks, and so definitely at least a little bit concerning there. My dud of the series is going to go to Niles in the top lane. Watching him versus Fake God, it was very apparent that Fake God is the best top laner in the NACL, and that's unfortunately all I can really say about that. Niles just didn't have a great series, and he's been significantly less consistent recently. Not that Niles has ever been the player to lose gracefully, like, no offense to him, but he is someone who is going to either dominate or get dominated sometimes, and that was just kind of the case in this series, but not a great loss from him. I think Zyko was very, very poor in this series. I like Zyko a lot. I've said that a lot on this channel, but I didn't think it was great. And the player that I think has been the most consistent, arguably the best player for Maryville over the course of this split, Odd Orange, I think was also not particularly great. Tomio was just significantly more active. He had full jungle pressure, and Odd Orange just really wasn't able to keep up. You could say the same thing about Get Back. You could say the same thing about Scary Jerry. Like, you could really point to Maryville just kind of getting outclassed in this series, and, on one level, it should be expected because they're Maryville and it's DSG, and, preseason predictions would tell you that this is how it should go, but with Maryville playing so well over the course of the middle of this split, I think you were just hoping for a bit of a closer series that you didn't quite get, and so hopefully this team is going to be able to figure out whatever's going on right now. Maybe their schedule is just getting more difficult. I'd have to, take a look, but they haven't been nearly as good towards the back half of the split as they were kind of in the middle, in my opinion. And then for DSG, they're looking a lot better now. Hopefully they're able to keep this up. 2-0ing Maryville's great. You got to be able to keep the 2-0s rolling, or at the very least 1-1s against the best teams in the league. There are a lot of really good teams, and you need to be able to step up the consistency to be able to keep up with them. And then moving on to our second series of the second slate here, we had Supernova taking on Evil Genius's challengers. And EG with a 2-0 series win. Okay, I don't want to do this with this team. I really don't like going back and forth with this team as much as they make me go back and forth and back and forth. It feels like every single time I'm out, they reel me back in. They're like, hey, actually, we can win some games. We're better than the bottom teams. And I'm like, I know you're better than the bottom teams, but you get so inconsistent, you're going to lose 0-2 to, Team Fish Taco next week or whatever, right? Like, it's very confusing to try and get a grasp on where this Evil Geniuses team lands, but they were really good in this series, and a lot of the players that, needed to step up, stepped up. Top side of the map was really phenomenal for Evil Geniuses, and I think that's the big positive. Player of the series for me is going to go to Ryoma. His traditional fantastic game of the week. It feels like he has a couple of these every single week where it's just like, I'm really, really good. He'll also have one miserable performance, but most of the games he plays are really, really good, and he was phenomenal in this series. Yes, he was going into Robbie Bob, who we'll get to, is just not really translated to the NACL all that, comfortably, but I think Ryoma still, it's not just Robbie Bob that he's beating up on. It's not just, these more questionable mid laners that don't have as much experience. It's almost random who he ends up beating. He can beat anybody in the league, and that's why I had him so high in my rankings going into the split, because truly, he has shown the ability to beat everybody. We know that he's, a super good, off the rift, locker room guy. He keeps spirits high for the team. Everybody likes playing with him, and so, again, I understand why he's on this team, and I also understand why people are frustrated with him because of the inconsistency here at this level, but he was amazing in this series. I want to give a ton of credit to Shaden as well in that same vein. He was really good. He almost got my player of the series. It felt like he was facilitating everything for this Evil Geniuses team. Ryoma was the one to clean up a lot of it, especially in game 1, and really in game 2 as well, but especially in game number 1, but I would be remiss to not mention Shaden as somebody to look out for, is obviously so talented. We saw what he could do in an infrastructure like Cloud9. The inconsistencies have just, really, really piled up. We saw the same thing with Tomio when he was on this Evil Geniuses team, where he was a really, really talented player that we all knew could be one of the best junglers in the entire NACL, and it just never really came together for an extended period of time until he got off the organization. I'm not going to say that the same thing needs to happen to Shaden, but we know he can be a really good jungler at this level. He just needs to be able to put it together. But Shaden and Ryoma were really good in this series, and Surdy has continued to just be a major positive for this team. He's been probably the better top laner in almost every single series that he's played for Evil Geniuses. I really see him as a pretty massive upgrade over Soul. No offense to Soul, I think he could be a great player. It felt like he was in his own head a little bit, especially towards the back half of his time, but Surdy is so good. He was really, really good on Team Liquid first last split as well. He was the player that I was consistently calling out for being one of the better top laners in all of the NACL on a team that just wasn't able to enable him in the same way. So now that he's on, an Evil Geniuses Challengers team that can win through other avenues as well, I think he continues to look fantastic, and he's someone who, next year, could he be a top 1, top 2 top laner in the NACL? Yes, absolutely. I really do believe that for Surdy. So top side of the map was good, bot side of the map was good as well, but when you're pointing out everybody except for King on an Evil Geniuses team, that's a pretty damn good series, because he's kind of been the hard carry for them across this year so far. And then for Supernova, it was just the carry roles that weren't able to step up. Dud of the series was a tough decision. I'm going to give it to Sketch in the bot lane. He's really not been good over the back half of this split. I was actually very high on Sketch and Trevor, not only going into the split, but through the first week or two of the split. It felt like, yeah, I was right. Those two are going to be the power point of the map for Supernova. They're going to be what this team wants to play through, but it's really not been that over the back half of the split. Sketch in particular, I think, has just been incredibly inconsistent, and he is going to get my dud of the series here. It's just very frustrating to see, because I like Sketch quite a bit as a player, but he's just never really been able to consistently have an entire split here at this level at tier 2 and look great. I know obviously last split there were a lot of complications. He was playing support for most of it. Not exactly the best situation, but this was kind of his opportunity, I think, to show hey, I'm still pretty good at AD carry, and I can definitely be, a main focal point for a team, and it just hasn't necessarily worked out in that way. Him and Trevor really have not had the best synergy towards the back half of the split, and I think this series it was definitely apparent. But then Robbie Bob, it's just unfortunate. It feels like that his talent level just isn't there right now. Maybe it's a confidence thing. You never really know, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that he's definitely not good enough, but of all the tier 2 tape I've watched, it's just not really ever been as proactive as a lot of the other mid laners that I get to watch on a weekly basis. And so hopefully, he can figure something out on that level, because Robbie Bob was so fun to watch in collegiate. Sketch is a really fun player to watch watch, especially when he was playing in Tier 3, and so I really hope that a lot of these players are able to kind of figure their stuff out, but the carry duo for Supernova, not particularly good in this series. Not that anybody else was. This was definitely an Evil Genius's favored series, but definitely worth pointing out that I think those two were probably the most noticeably outclassed in this one for me. But congrats to Evil Geniuses. A 2-0 win is very good. They do lead the entire NACL in 0-2 losses, but they have 4 2-0 wins as well, and that's right up there. I mean, it's basically the same as Disguised, right? That's more than AoE, and so there's so many different, like, weird little intricacies that this team has going for them at the current moment in terms of just they either win or they lose, and they win hard or they lose hard, and I think it kind of makes them an interesting team to watch moving forward. And then finally, we've got our 5th and final series of day 1, and it was a matchup between AoE Gold and FlyQuest Challengers. That Fly Challengers was going to be able to take 2-0. Now, again, I just want to see the top teams do well, and the top teams absolutely did well in this series. No offense to AoE, they had a really good week number 4. They really skyrocketed up in my power rankings after showing a lot of consistency, but FlyQuest is just on a different level in terms of what they should be getting done at this level, and I think they absolutely accomplished that with the 2-0 here. We've been not worried about this team, but I think there are definitely some question marks, and I think almost all of them have been answered over the last couple of series. This team is very quickly going to make its way up the power rankings, maybe even to number 1 if they continue to play at this level, but player of the series for me is going to go to Yuji in the jungle. I've been so high on Yuji across this entire split. I almost feel like he's gone under the radar. I think a lot of people are talking about Mir. I think a lot of people are talking about Keel, but for me, Yuji has arguably been number 1 across this entire split. Keel is definitely in that conversation for me as well, but Yuji has been, like, legitimately fantastic for FlyQuest. I would argue that he's been easily their best player in the summer split in 2023, so that's really, really huge for this team. It feels like he's consistently able to generate a lot of early game leads, and it's not like he was going into some scrub jungler in this series. He was going into Will, who I consider to be kind of the backbone, the heart and soul of AoE. And so for Yuji to be able to get early leads in both games and just be able to kind of transition that really well into the mid game, his aggressive style is definitely working out, and I think he's been playing great. But again, Spyrax playing phenomenal. He's stepped it up so much in recent weeks. I don't want to say he stepped it up so much because that makes it sound like he was like a disaster at the beginning of the year in the split, but I don't necessarily believe he was a disaster. He was just kind of like, all right, man, like, you really need to start playing up to your skill level. We know how good you can be, but if you look at the last 5 series, he's arguably been the best mid laner in the NACL across that period of time. He was awesome again in this series, just completely outclassed Dark Wings. It's just a confidence thing with him. I think he got his confidence back. I think he learned how to play with the rest of the team in a way that really worked for him, and now he can get back to that style that he was at in 2022, where we were all looking at him as one of the more interesting mid laners in the entire NACL and in Academy, and so really, really happy to see that for him. If he can keep that up, he might even get an LCS promotion. Ha ha ha. Obviously, I'm recording this on Friday. I know we got the LCS promotion, so really, really good stuff from him, but he's been fantastic, and he absolutely has deserved it in recent weeks. Masu was really good. Faisal was really good. Winsome has been one of the better supports, if not the best support in the NACL across this year so far. FlyQuest is just clicking, I think, at the right time. We talked about teams at the beginning that are finding their groove at the exact right moment. I think FlyQuest is kind of the epitome of that in my eyes. And then for AoE on the other side, just not quite as good. A couple of positives. I actually think the bot lane was relatively good for AoE. Lynx and Breezy have been solid over the course of this split. I think Lynx hasn't been quite as aggressive as maybe I would like. I'd like to see him step up and be a little bit more of like the game changer, but you're kind of leaving that up to your mid-jungle duo, which I understand. Like, I get the idea behind that. I just think that, you know, when the mid-jungle duo struggles, you need Lynx to be a little bit more aggressive and trying to take those leads back, and it didn't feel like he was that. You know, in this entire series, he just played really, really well. He did his ADC job really well. And Breezy, for his credit, I think has also been great. He's going to go under the radar as one of the best supports in the NACL, but he's another player that I think you could slot into the LCS basically right now, and he would be more than competent at being able to win you games. But dud of the series for me is going to go to Dark Wings in the mid lane. Talked about Spyrax being super good in this series. Dark Wings was kind of the other side of that, just outclassed in a lot of different areas, was not really out on the map nearly as much as he should have been, and he was losing lane in both games, and that's going to happen into a player that's really playing at a high level right now, but this has been a problem for Dark Wings all split, in particular in the summer, which is the inconsistencies, the ups and downs, the good versus bad. The bad has been there a little bit more prevalently than maybe I would have anticipated or would have wanted to see from him, and so hopefully he can get a little bit more consistent, because I do really like him as a player. It just really hasn't been there in summer for me, even though there have been good performances, and then Concept in the top lane was also also not particularly good for this team, but I hate to say it, he hasn't been particularly good for this team or for a lot of the teams that he's played for at the NACL level. I just think he's a very feast or famine player. You're hoping that you can win through jungle mid, or you're hoping that Lynx can step up and be a little bit more aggressive, because I don't think you're going to be gaining a ton of advantages on the top side. Hopefully Concept can fix that. I really like the eclectic champion pool. It just hasn't necessarily worked out. On stage, at least at this moment. So for AoE, I still think that they're a good team. Like, this isn't going to throw out the opinion that I had on them coming out of last week, where they were pretty solid, but it is certainly worth noting that a couple of these players might not be able to hold up against the best teams in the entire league come playoff time. But then for FlyQuest, this is one of the best teams in the entire league, if not the best team. With TL, I don't want to say struggling, because that's really like oversimplifying the problem, but being a little bit more volatile than they were at the beginning, not being the obvious #1 team in the league like they were for a lot of the split. FlyQuest is right there to be able to try and take that throne from them, to take the reins back from that, and I think they're one of the more intriguing teams to watch. If they can continue to play super well through jungle mid, obviously bot lane's really, really good. We all knew they were going to be good, and Faisal's been playing at least a little bit more consistent in recent weeks. They could actually be the best team in the NACL. And then moving on to our second day here of action here in week number 5. We've got it up on the screen right now. 5 more games to cover here, and we get to talk about the first one being Team Fish Taco taking on Evil Geniuses Challengers, and it is a 1-1 split, although it was not a particularly interesting 1-1 split. This is basically exactly what we expected out of both of these teams. I don't really see them all that differently. Both of them can be rather volatile. I think Evil Geniuses just has better highs than Taco does, which is unfortunate for, Taco and that team, but I think we're starting to see a little bit more out of these teams and starting to get a really good idea of what they are, and I think this series was just kind of that in a nutshell. I do think Taco was actually probably a little bit more dominant in terms of their win in this series. I think game 1 was certainly a little bit more interesting to look at, particularly because, again, Spawn was awesome. He's going to get my player of the series. He really has been very good for this Taco team over the course of the year. I'm not going to say he's been perfect. There are definitely still flaws with this game. Sometimes he can be a little bit of a scoreboard warrior where his score looks a little bit better than maybe the impact that he had on the game as a whole, because sometimes he can just be a little bit too passive. Sometimes he's a little bit risk averse, and that can mean that sometimes the score looks good, right? He can get a lot of kills and not a lot of deaths, but it might not mean all that much. I don't necessarily think that was the case in a lot of the series this week. I think he genuinely was fantastic for this Taco team, and he still is a really good player. You could put him on a top 1 or top 2 team in the NACL, and he would do just fine in that circumstance. But I think Onat also had a really good series here, going into Ryoma, who I'll talk about, also had a good series. I think both mid laners definitely played well in this one, but Onat was particularly good. I think NXI had a much better series. Again, he's just very feast or famine. He's very aggressive. He's going to be making a lot of plays. Sometimes they're going to work out, and sometimes they're not. I would rather him be a player like that, though, than a player that takes a little bit more of a backseat. It very much reminds me of that, like, On or Hillisang kind of play style, where it's like, I'm going to make a ton of plays, and they're either going to go really well or they're going to go really poorly, and, I don't know which one it's going to be at the beginning of each game. I think NXI is an interesting support prospect. It hasn't necessarily gone as well in recent weeks, but I still think he can be a very good player. But Onat, like I said, was really good. I think topside was a little bit questionable. Still not sold on Rosethorn. Like, I just don't think he's really all that good, if I'm being entirely honest. I like him as a prospect, and I remember going back to his time on CLG, I was really interested in him, but, the time on Golden Guardians really wasn't all that spectacular, and now here on Taco, I really just haven't mentioned him all that much this year. He really hasn't been someone that has stood out either for good or for bad this split, and I guess that's a good thing, but I also wish he could be a little bit more than what he is. He's just kind of been there, and I think that's a little bit concerning. And then dud of the series for me is actually going to go to Lunacia. I hate doing this because it feels like every time Taco 1-1s a series, it feels like Lunacia ends up getting dud of the series, and that's not necessarily fair to him. I think he's a relatively good player, but I think the inconsistencies are there. He's going to have some bad games every once in a while, especially when the rest of the team isn't playing for him as much as they do in some of them, and I think especially in game number 2, he just wasn't very good. I think you could point out pretty much everybody else on the team having, good performances, making an impact on the game, especially in game number 1, and I just think his was the least impactful in the win, and you could say the same thing for Evil Geniuses, which is why, unfortunately, he gets dead of the series, but when you look at the amount of those that he's gotten over the course of this split, it is certainly not indicative of his skill level, in my opinion. He's much better than I think what I've ended up showing off for him. So I like Taco, but I don't think they're anything like crazy special. They're one of the teams that really are in the bottom 2 right now, and I think that definitely is shown in a series like this. But for Evil Geniuses, like, I also wanted to see more from you. It felt like you were finally starting to find your stride, but it was just a rather inconsistent series. I think both of the carry duo kind of stepped up here. King had a much better series than I think he had on day number 1, which is funny considering the team 2-0'd on day number 1, but Ryoma, I think, continued to look really good this week. Just really consistent play coming out from him. It's really good to see those two players in particular step up, being the two veterans on this team. If they're going to, I think, be a little bit more consistent down the stretch, those are the two players that are going to need to be a little bit more active and a little bit more positive for them. I think the rest of the team was fine, but King and Ryoma were definitely the two standout members. But overall, I think Evil Geniuses really wanted to win this series 2-0. Taco's been a team that has very much been beatable over the course of this split, and unfortunately, Evil Genius is just not able to get the job done in this one. It's not going to be the worst thing in the world, but, the hype around Evil Geniuses potentially, kind of collapsing into that top 5, potentially being an interesting team to watch out for, I just don't think is really all that real at the current moment. They're still inconsistent, and they're still in the bottom half of teams, in my opinion. And then for Taco, solid win here. Again, it's another 1-1 draw. You've gotten 8 of these over the course of this split, which is absolutely astounding. But this team has its clear strengths and weaknesses. Spawn is a really good player, and NXI can generate leads. Onat's been kind of interesting, and Lunacia can win every once in a while, especially with resources. But, game to game, this team just isn't going to have the consistency to be able to keep up with a lot of the other teams at the NACL level. And I think we kind of saw that in this one again as well. And then moving on to our second to the first slate of games here, we had a matchup between Supernova and Cincinnati Fear, and this is one of the two series on this day that I actually commentated or watched along with on my Twitch channel. Again, link to that's going to be down in the description below. You can go ahead and check that out. You can check out the VOD if you want to see my live reactions to both this series and the DSG TL series, which obviously were some really interesting ones, but let's go ahead and kind of give a breakdown of it. This was a 1-1 split between both of these teams, and really, it probably shouldn't have been. Fear was so ridiculously dominant in game number 1. They just completely steamrolled Supernova to the point where I'm shocked that Supernova had the mental and the confidence to be able to come back and win game number 2, but again, a lot of credit to that team to be able to fortify their own heads, to not give up, know it's just one game, and be able to come back and just kind of win again. The last time these two teams played, Fear also kind of dominated them, so for Supernova to say, screw it, we're just going to go out with the final game that we're probably going to play against this team this split and really look good, I think it's a good sign from them, but really, this is about Fear, and this is about Fear continuing to look fantastic. You really wish you would have won game 2, because I think that really would have, set you apart from a lot of the rest of the teams and, put yourself, in a pretty good position to be moving into the back half of the split, but still, being able to dominate game number 1 was really positive. Player of the series for me is, again, going to go to Shochi. He really has been phenomenal across this entire split. Consistently, every single game, it feels like I'm bringing him up as a massive positive. I don't know if I'm willing to say he's been the best mid laner in the NACL, because obviously APA was fantastic at the beginning of the split. Him being able to move up to the LCS, I think definitely, kind of takes him out of the MVP conversation, because he's not going to be playing towards the back half of the split. And I think Shochi is definitely someone who could take that spot over, especially if, first team mid laner, right, whatever you want to say. But Spyrax, I think, has also been really good. It's just kind of up to personal opinion, but Shochi is definitely right up there with basically everybody else, in my opinion, and consistency-wise, I think he's been the most consistent mid laner in the NACL this split, and it's just really good to see him completely emerge and really prove to everybody that it's not ambiguous anymore. He is one of the best mid laners in Tier 2, and I think definitely could make an impact in Tier 1 if he were given that opportunity, but rest of the team continuing to play well. Manui had a phenomenal game number 1, really the entire team did, but Manui played really, really well in game number 1. I thought Perry also played fantastic, was just dominating music in that first game, invading his jungle constantly, being able to take over and really just kind of strangle out everything that Supernova wanted to do game plan wise. It was really difficult for them to be able to generate any sort of advantages, and so big ups to Fear. I think the rest of the team also played well. Philip had one of his better games in game number 1, and I think JJ was also really good. Just everybody on Fear really, playing up to the skill level. Now, game 2 certainly probably should have been a win. They were in a relatively decent spot. Shochi was relatively fed again, but they just couldn't team fight. They couldn't win any of the fights towards the back half of the game, and so they ended up losing the series, but still, overall, I would say Fear is probably going to be happy with this outcome. And then for Supernova on the other side, they're probably also going to be happy to be able to take that game number 2, being the better team overall, but man, game number 1 was really rough to watch. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Sketch in the bot lane. I think you could give this to Trevor as well. It's one of the members of the bot lane who both just got completely run over in this series, in my opinion, and I don't want to say I'm completely out, but I'm very close to just being completely out on this bot lane. They've both been very bad over the course of the past few weeks. I mean, Trevor's had moments where he's looked okay, but Sketch in particular has just kind of not been very good over the past 6 or 7 series, and it's definitely something to be concerned about at this point. Hopefully they can figure something out, but really, dud of the series is going to everybody on Supernova in game number 1, where they just got completely run over. But if you're looking for a positive in game number 2, Music definitely comes to mind. He's been relatively up and down. I think Supernova in general has been relatively up and down, but I think top side of the map has definitely been the positive overall. Quacker, in my opinion, is definitely the standout player on Supernova, but Music has kind of been in that conversation for me as well. I think those two have been the ones to continue to watch, whereas I think the rest of the team has very much been a little bit shaky. But, you know, I think Supernova in general is probably a bottom 2 team. They're going to be happy to be able to take a game off of Fear, who really do look fantastic right now, but that shellacking in game number 1 is really hard to overlook. And then, like I said, for Fear, they're probably going to be happy with the 1-1. You probably would have liked the 2-0 in this situation, going up against a team that a lot of people consider to be maybe the weakest in the NACL. When you're on such a hot streak, you would have expected to be able to take some more from that, but being able to at least dominate in game number 1, I think, is a good, you know, good little example of what this team can do. Then moving on to our second slate of games here, and this is the other one that I watched live on my Twitch channel this week. We had DSG Disguised taking on Team Liquid Challengers, and TLC is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 series win. Now, this is exactly what you wanted to see if you were a Team Liquid fan. You wanted to see this team be able to come out and beat DSG rather convincingly, walk away with a 2-0 win, and have a lot of the players that you really needed to step up in this one, and I think that's exactly what happened. This mid-jungle duo was genuinely fantastic, and really, you got to give a lot of credit where it is due. We talked about him being relatively inconsistent on his first series back here in the NACL, but Series 2, there was no mistaking it. Player of the series is going to go to Harry in the mid lane. Really, really good series from him overall. He just kind of dominated DSG, and he dominated Young in particular. Harry's one of those players that I think is really, really talented, and honestly got overlooked at the LCS level, was often put in really poor positions, was definitely better on specific champions than he was on others at the LCS level, but still, I think is someone who can perform pretty highly if given the opportunity there. It just wasn't a great situation for him, always playing like fifth fiddle to everybody else on that Team Liquid team that was always going to take precedent. So him coming back into the NACL and getting the opportunity to be a primary carry, he shows that he can still be that for a lot of teams, and he was really fantastic in this series. And so certainly an intriguing problem to have for Team Liquid, having 2 really good mid laners on the roster. I do believe that APA is probably the better player at the current moment, which we're seeing in LCS results. I probably would have told you that before he went up to the LCS roster, though. I just think Harry is also a really good player. I think both are, you know, top 11, top 12 mid laners in North America at the current moment, and that's a very good problem to have. But it wasn't just him. Mir had another really good series, and what a shock. Mir continues to be a massive positive for this team and just one of the most consistent players in the entire league regardless of position. I think a lot of people would argue he's the single best jungler in the NACL, and how am I to argue that? Hasn't exactly been the flashiest, but certainly is someone that I think you can rely on game to game to generate so many leads for his laners, and he did that again here, mostly with Harry, but also with Arrow in the bot lane as well, who also had a very good series here going into DSG, was definitely the better bot laner, and was doing a lot of really big positive things for his team. Him and Kim Down, I think, were significantly more positive in this series than they had been in a couple of the previous ones, and so just good stuff overall for Team Liquid. I still want to see Bradley step up and be a little bit more active in this matchup, but he still was relatively fine, was given a couple of bad lane matchups and survived them. And so overall, Team Liquid looking like we wanted them to, and Harry in particular stepping up and looking good. And then for DSG, just not really the look that you wanted. You want to see this team at least be able to take a game off of Team Liquid, probably at their weakest point in the summer split so far, and it just wasn't going to happen. We talked about the inconsistencies coming in the bot lane, and that was exactly what we got here. Dead of the series is going to go to Meech, and this really is kind of the epitome of what I was talking about when it comes to Meech and when it comes to DSG in general, where some of these games he's going to look really fantastic and some of these games he's going to look really bad. And in this series, he looked really bad. Arrow was significantly outclassing him because he wasn't giving over a ton of resources for free. Mir did a better job than Tomio of being able to generate a lot of pressure in the mid game, and so Meech didn't have nearly as much prio to make a lot of the plays that he wanted to make, and I think he really struggled because of that. It wasn't just him. I think Fake God had a particularly poor series on the top side, a very uncharacteristically poor series on the top side. Like I said before, Young just kind of got completely outclassed in the mid lane, and Zazel certainly didn't do Meech any favors. But I think overall for DSG, it's most noticeable when the AD carry struggles, because I think a lot of their advantages and a lot of their pressure ends up landing in the bot lane. And so when Meech is having a poor series, or when Meech is having to play from behind a little bit more than he would have to in a couple of other series, I definitely think it's very, very noticeable. And so for DSG, I think their advantages have been very clearly defined, and their disadvantages have been very clearly defined as as a top team in the league. It's going to be interesting to see if teams try to take advantage of that once we get into the playoff time, but for now, they just feel like a team that's very close to being great, but might not be exactly there at the current moment. And then for Team Liquid, it's really nice to see this. This is a team that, should, for all intents and purposes, be the clear-cut #1 team in the NACL, and they haven't exactly performed like it in the last couple of series, but having this bounce back here, Harry showing that he can integrate himself into this team just as well as APA could, it really does bring a lot of confidence that this team is as good as I think we all hoped they would be. And then moving on to our 4th series of day number 2, and we had a matchup between Maryville University and AOE Gold. That AOE is going to be able to take 2-0. Maryville feels like they have just completely regressed back to what we saw in week number 1. It feels like this team just can't really generate a lot of the advantages in the way that they were generating them in a lot of the couple of middle weeks that they were actually looking really good. And AOE, kind of the opposite. They're really starting to peak at the current moment. That really started in week number 4, but it is absolutely continuing here in week number 5. They are kind of proving that at the current moment, they are better than the bottom tier teams in the league. Now, going up against the best teams in the league, that's very much still a question mark, but that's a problem that they can get to another day. They were really good in this series. Player of the series was very difficult for me because I think there were 3 players that all played out of their minds and probably equally as good. And so for me, it was just a very difficult decision to make on the side of AoE, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to Darkwings in the mid lane. Talked about how he's been very inconsistent, very up and down. That absolutely continues here because he was pretty down on day number 1, but he's super up here on day number 2. He destroyed Maryville, was absolutely better than Get Back on the other side of the map, was significantly more active, and man, he capitalized on a lot of the creation that the rest of this team did for him in a relatively fantastic manner. I think a lot of people want to give this to Lynx as well. Lynx was really good in this series, and honestly, he's had a really good week up until this point. He was good on both day 1 and day 2, even in their loss. It's really good to see him get a little bit more consistent. If the bot lane can turn into kind of the consistent part of this team, alongside Will, and then you can have some big upside coming out of your mid lane, that could be a really big positive and a really big way to win games for AoE on a more consistent basis. And so for Lynx to have such a good series, I think that's a positive. Will continues to be such a major W for this team. He's just good in every single matchup. He can basically play anything at this point. I know we were a little concerned that he was a little bit out of meta in terms of the champions that were good right now and the champions that he likes to play. He likes to be a little bit more of a carry, likes more of those marksman styles, was never really known for his engage, tank junglers, but he's been really good at them, and he's been really good at that style, basically across the entire split up until this point. So Darkwings, Lynx, Will, whoever you want to give player of the series to, I think they absolutely deserve it. All 3 of them played out of their minds. And Breezy and Concept, I think, played well in that same vein. Concept was the better top laner in this series, which is always going to be a really good thing to hear. But he looked really good in the laning phase, and I think that's exactly what you want to see. Breezy continues to be awesome. That's not a surprise. But basically everybody on AoE stepping up and looking good in this one. And then for Maryville on the other side, kind of a bummer of a series, because this really was one I think you wanted to at least prove that you were still middle of the table in, but I don't think you really proved that at all here. I think you proved that the downward trajectory really is, unfortunately, kind of real at the current moment. Dud of the series could go to either of the 2 on the top side of the map. I'm going to give it to Niles in the top lane, but you could give this to Odd Orange as well. I think both were really bad, equally in this series, both kind of in different games. Odd Orange was really bad in game number 1, really was not able to generate any sort of pressure against Will, and then Niles kind of got run over in game number 2 on the Gwen, and so both just in situations where it wasn't particularly positive for them. You could give it to either. I gave it to Niles because I thought the Gwen game was a little bit more noticeable in terms of the negatives overall, but I mean, really neither of them played well in this series, and when you look at what got Maryville here in the first place to the NACL, like through qualifications, these 2 players were such major positives for them and such focal points for how they wanted to play the game, Odd Orange in particular, that when they struggle, I think it's going to be a struggle for Maryville to be able to consistently pick up wins. Get Back has been pretty good, especially over the second half of this split, but it's certainly not good enough to be able to make up for the fact that Odd Orange is losing a lot of pressure in the jungle, or Niles is losing the Concept on the top side of the map. And, Jerry and Zyko, I think, are fine, but they're really not like a takeover bot lane. They're one of the less dominant ones in the NACL, at least throughout this split up until this point. So you really are relying, especially on that jungle position, I think, to step up and really be a big positive. And Odd Orange has, for the most part, this split, but this was a rough series. And then, like I said, Niles also struggling. I certainly don't think helps matters all that much. But overall, Maryville definitely kind of on a downward trajectory. I'm significantly more concerned about this team than I was 2 weeks ago. I was, with them at like number 6 in the power rankings, maybe even number 5 should things continue to go well, but I'm really certainly not in that zone anymore. I think teams like AoE and perhaps even Evil Geniuses have much higher upsides, and I think, AoE proved that in this series. They look really good. Will is just so crazy good, and I think Lynx is starting to find form right now with Breezy, and I think that's going to be a big positive. If Darkwings can have more of these positive performances than the negative ones that we've seen sometimes throughout this split, I really do think AoE could be a very interesting team going into playoffs. And then moving on to our final series here of day number 2, and it was a matchup between Wildcard Gaming and FlyQuest Challengers, a battle of 2 of the top 4 teams in the league at the current moment. Wildcard has been phenomenal up until this point, but FlyQuest proving that, no, actually, we're still one of the best teams in the entire league, and as good as Wildcard has been, we're still better. This is a 2-0 win for FlyQuest, and I hate to say it, this is kind of what you want to see for FlyQuest. If you are a FlyQuest fan, you want to see them be able to take care of a team like Wildcard, who, yes, is overperforming and playing incredibly well up until this point, but very much has a specific playstyle, and Fly, I think, in general, should kind of be beating everybody in the league with their talent level on this team, and so to see them perform up to the expectation that I think a lot of people had set for them at the beginning of the split is a really good thing, and they're once again proving that they are at worst, like a top 2 team in the NACL at the current moment with how they are playing, and I think they definitely proved that in this one. The 2-0 was really, really good. A lot of players playing well for FlyQuest, a lot of players that I've already brought up, but again, it's the middle 3, and I know I've said, those roles a lot over the course of today in particular, but that's really how it ended up being. My player of the series is going to go to UG again in the jungle. He's been so phenomenal. I mean, I think you can make a really strong case, especially with APA no longer being in the league, that UG is the front runner for MVP, for most valuable prospect so far this split. He's just been so good for FlyQuest. I think obviously Spyrax in that same vein has also been really good, and we'll get to him. He was fantastic in this series as well, but going into a jungler like Keel, who, you can sit here and talk about all the negatives you want in terms of like, oh, crazy picks. Can he play the real ones? He's proven he can play like the meta ones this split. He has done them at a very high level, but I mean, he destroyed Keel in this series. Keel had the worst series he's had as a pro in a very long time. UG made him look completely inept in this series, and I think that really just goes to show you how good UG is and just how well he's playing at the current moment. So I would really take UG over almost anybody at the current moment. That's really how well he's currently playing, and so ups to him. Spyrax again was really good in the mid lane. He's been really good over the past couple of series. It's crazy just how consistent he has turned into, after really not having a great start to the year, not even having a great start to the split. Over the past 6 or so series, he's just so clearly been the best mid laner in the NACL. It's actually absurd. So really big ups to him. He's been fantastic. And Masu finally had one of those traditionally great Masu series. It feels like he's taken a pretty big backseat on this team in the last couple of weeks. UG and Spyrax have definitely been kind of the focal point for everything that FlyQuest has done. But, I think Masu is obviously still Masu. There was a reason he almost won MVP, having, missed a couple of games last split. It's because he's really, really freaking good. And if he's the one taking a backseat on this team, that's how you know FlyQuest is in a really good spot. So those 3 stepping up, I think Winsome's obviously been great. Faisal has been super good over the past couple of weeks. This team is just really, really fun to watch, and honestly might be the single best team in the NACL at the moment. But for Wildcard, unfortunate loss here. This really just was you getting outclassed. There really is no other way to say it. This was kind of a destruction. Dud of the series is no-brainer going to go to Keel in the jungle. I love Keel. I've been very vocal about how much I like Keel on this channel, about how I think he's underrated by the community. I think that he kind of gets labeled as this guy who can only play, his certain pocket picks, but he has very, rarely pulled those out across this split, and it's been the best split of his entire career. He's been phenomenal on basically everything that he's played this year so far, and so I think that narrative has kind of been busted over the course of this year, but you gotta say, he got destroyed in this series by UG. It really was not close in terms of the jungle matchup. UG was just significantly better in basically every aspect of the game, and it's gonna happen. You're allowed to have a bad series every once in a while. This was just a really, really bad series, and Wildcard, I think, is gonna find it very difficult to win if Keel loses as hard as he does. This team really does kind of run through him, and it was a difficult series for him, but everybody else was also playing poorly. Donbray in particular, I think, had some really bad moments in the bot lane, but Lens, I don't think, was great. Saligo certainly didn't play up to his standards. Zamudo really wasn't all that much of a factor. So Wildcard in general, I think, just kind of underperformed in this series. But again, it's against FlyQuest Challengers. Like, how much do I even really want to read into that? This is one of the best teams in the NACL, and you weren't able to go up against them. Whatever. Like, that's kind of expected. This is still a really good team, and I still think that they're going to be a lot better than a lot of the teams that are around them in the standings. But they're not going to be on the same level as maybe the single best teams in the league, but FlyQuest really is that. They're one of the best teams, if not the best team in the league, and they have a lot of players that I think are really in contention for being some of the best in the entire league at the current moment. And now, finally, moving on to day number 3, our third and final day here of week number 5, and we got to kick it off with a matchup between Team Fish Taco and AoE Gold. Kind of interesting that Taco had the first series in all 3 days this week. Just kind of a weird little coincidence, I guess, but AoE picking up the 2-0 series win here. They continue to look really good basically throughout this entire week and last week as well. This is a team that is peaking at the exact right time, and really there's not a lot of negatives to say about them in their current moment. They just LCS look better than a lot of the other bottom teams in the league. And, maybe they're not going to be able to go up against the best teams, but they look pretty good in their own little bracket and in their own little isolation, which I think is as good as you can say. Player of the series for me, it's going to go to Will. I love me some Will. I think you could absolutely put him on the best NACL team, and he would be, one of those junglers that you simply have to game plan for every single game. He's an LCS caliber jungler. He has been for quite a while. We knew that before he left and went over to Korea to boot camp, and now that he's come back, he's just as good. I mean, the dude is absolutely smurfing for AoE Gold. He's been good against all different levels of competition. He's just really consistent. Really like him as a player. I absolutely think you could build an NACL team around him, and I think every single LCS org should be very much looking at him and saying, like, all right, well, what's he going to cost to end up bringing in for our LCS team, especially if you're not winning a whole ton right now, because I really do think he's the type of player that can completely turn around an organization. Really, really good stuff from him. The bot lane was also really good in this series. Lynx and Breezy continue to have a very good week just in general, and that's such a major positive for AoE. Again, if Lynx can step up and be that more consistent threat coming out of the bot lane, especially towards the back half of games, to allow Will to be more aggressive, to allow Darkwings to be more aggressive, that's going to be so huge for this AoE team, and I really do think that's going to unlock everything. This team didn't coincidentally do really well this week. They did really well this week because the players that we knew were good, like Will, did end up stepping up and being really good, but Lynx in particular really, really backed him up, I think, this week, and it really pushes the floor of this team a lot higher if the bot lane is going to be as good and as consistent as they were in week number 5. So good stuff overall from them. I would say in general, AoE just looked really solid and like the better team in this series. And then for Taco on the other side, they're just not very good. I know we all kind of held out hope for this Taco team throughout the split because there have been moments where they've looked relatively interesting, being able to go up against good teams and actually be able to look like they can compete against them, but it's just not meant to be. They're really not talented enough, and it really does feel like they're kind of crashing back down to earth towards the back half of the split. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Onat in the mid lane. Just not a great series coming in from Onat. He's had a couple of bad ones over the course of this split. He's had a couple of really good ones as well, so I don't want to say that he's just been bad for this team. I think he's been better than the bottom tier mid laners in the league. Like, I certainly think he deserves a spot here in the NACL, and he's kind of proven that over the course of this split, but that doesn't mean that every single game has been good for him. He had a little bit of a rough week this week, and I think this series was definitely kind of an example of that. NXI's aggressiveness also didn't quite pay off in this one, and so, Taco's kind of early aggression really wasn't all that much and all that prevalent. Will really could just do whatever he wanted for most of the early games, so basically AoE just got everything they were looking for. For Taco, I think this is more in line with the kind of production and experiences we can expect towards them for the back half of this split. They look like a bottom 2 team that is likely to miss playoffs at the current moment, and I know that's kind of frustrating. There are really good players on this team. I really do like Spawn. I think Lunacia has a ton of upside. There are definitely interesting pieces, but it just looks like the surrounding core is going to be a little bit too much for them to be able to make it. But for AoE on the other side, this is a really good team. It's really hard not to like them in their current iteration. They're very much playing at a high level. And if they're going to be able to keep this up, I said it earlier this week, but playoffs is going to be really interesting because right now they're in fantastic form, and the top 4 or 5 seeds are definitely in a little bit of flux right now. So for AoE, you got to be able to keep this up because you're in a pretty decent spot. And then for our second series of the first slate of games, we had a matchup between Supernova and Team Liquid challengers, perhaps the best team in the league going into perhaps the worst team in the league. No flame either way, just kind of the way it has been over the course of the current split. And Team Liquid getting the job done, rightfully so, I think, in a lot of people's minds. This was a pretty dominant series from Team Liquid, and I think a lot of people would have been concerned if it would have been anything else. Of course, it's always fair game to see, one of the lower seeds upset one of the top seeds here in the NACL, where pretty much all the games are bangers, and trust me, we'll be getting into the all the games are bangers train in just a minute. But Team Liquid and Supernova, little bit of a blowout. This was probably the least close series of this third and final day of action. Team Liquid looking fantastic. Player of the series is going to go to Harry again in the mid lane. He really is like coming back down to the NACL and saying, like, this is what you were missing out on at the LCS level. You really should have trusted and believed in me a little bit more. Because these are the kinds of performances that I can put out when you trust and believe in me and put resources into me. That was something that the main roster basically never did for him, was play towards him in the mid lane, try to give him resources, try to get him into the mid game as a big carry, and he's been given that opportunity a lot here so far in the NACL, and he's basically gone through with it every single time. He absolutely destroyed Robbie Bob in lane and was really able to generate a massive lead, and then this team basically never looked back. It wasn't just him. Everybody on Team Liquid was phenomenal in this series. It's really hard to point to 1 or 2 or 3 players in particular that played well, more so than almost any other series that we've talked about this week, because everybody on Team Liquid stomped. Bradley was so much better in the top lane. You had a really, really good series out of Mir. Arrow, in particular, was the other one that you really got to point out as having a great series. I thought that Kim Down played particularly well. It really was everyone on Team Liquid that stepped up. And outside of Harry, I think everybody played like equally as good. Harry, in my opinion, was definitely the focal point and what this team wanted to play through. But outside of that, it really was a team effort. And I think you're going to be really excited to hear that. And then for Supernova, it's basically the opposite. This team just got completely rolled again. You got absolutely destroyed on day 2 in that one game by Fear. Really nice to see you be able to bounce back and keep your mental, but Team Liquid is a completely different animal at this point in the split. The rest of this team was just not going to be able to hold up. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Trevor in the support position. It's really hard to play and engage support on a team that has fallen super far behind against one of the best teams in the entire league, but unfortunately, that's what he was tasked with here today, and I don't think that it went particularly well. He was not very good, practically irrelevant throughout a lot of these games. He was going in or peeling just to instantly die in every single team fight. He made absolutely no impact. Robbie Bob is the other player that you can absolutely consider for Dud of the series here. Got absolutely blown back by Harry in lane and really had not a ton of impact on the game overall, but I hate to say it, it's not particularly surprising. I think you could give Dud of the series to the entirety of Supernova. I mean, that's really how this series went. Team Liquid just dominated, and Supernova just wasn't on this level. And you hate to see it, but it just kind of is what it is. Supernova is one of the bottom teams in the league. We just talked about Taco very likely not being, you know, a top 8 team, very likely being in the bottom 2. Supernova is right there with them, especially if they don't turn their form around. Those are the 2 teams that very much have to watch out not making top 8 at the current moment, and I think this series just kind of encompassed that. Again, losing to Team Liquid is certainly not the worst loss in the entire world. 0-2, like, you probably expected that to happen, but I would have liked to at least seen some level of fight in this series, and it just didn't feel like we got that. And then for Team Liquid, you look dominant. I was worried about you at the beginning of the week. It felt like this team was kind of starting to, you know, regress a little bit back to just being okay, but they were not just okay in this series. They absolutely dominated as they should have. It feels like Harry has integrated himself incredibly well into this NACL team, and everybody else is playing at a high level. Team Liquid still is probably the best team in the entire league, and this performance, I think, shows that off. And now we start to get into the real bangers here in the NACL in day number 3, because we get to talk about Maryville University taking on Wildcard Gaming. And man, this was an absolute blast of a series. I wanted to give player of the series to the fans, because I really do think they were the biggest winners across both of these games. Just an absolute blast to see 2 teams who are very aggressive be very aggressive into each other and just fight over and over and over and over again. That's exactly what we want to see here in the NACL. This is why I always talk about the NACL being one of the most fun regions to watch in the entire world. It's because you get games like this where it's just banger after banger. But let's give some analysis on what actually happened in this game. Wildcard was able to take the series 2-0, and that's a little bit of a trend if you haven't noticed. Every single series on day number 3 is a 2-0, but Wildcard, you know, being able to take this one was really, really good for them. They needed a bounce back after what was kind of a rough week for them up until this point. They had a very difficult schedule, had to face a lot of tough teams, and Maryville was kind of the reprieve from that, and Wildcard definitely showed, no, you know, we might not be FlyQuest, but we are still pretty damn good, a top 4 team in the NACL at the current moment, because they were aggressive, they were in your face, and they came to prove a point in this one, and the point was absolutely proven. Player of the series for me is going to go to Lens in the bot lane. Really good performance coming out from him. Again, I've actually been rather low on Lens and Donbray, not in a way that I think that they've been bad by any stretch of the imagination, but rather I think they've just kind of been a good bot lane, whereas the top side of the map has very much been what Wildcard has wanted to drive a lot of their strategies through, and I do think that that has continued to be the case, but Lens is really starting to step it up towards the back half of this split, especially when we get into big fiestas like this. If you have an AD carry that can go toe-to-toe and really team fight and really generate a lot of leads and team fight wins towards the back half of the game, that's so massive for you to be able to move forward. And I thought Lens was phenomenal in this series, so good performance from him. Keel had a very good bounce back, obviously was miserable in that series against FlyQuest, but was significantly better in this one against Maryville, which I guess is to be expected, you know, a little bit of a difference in opponents there, but Keel definitely getting back onto the train that he was on before, which I think we're all hoping to see maybe for the rest of the year. And then Saligo, I thought, was significantly better as well. Again, another player who I think you just give him some resources and give him some time. You allow him to team fight from relatively even, and he's going to perform at a relatively high level. He's just a very good player in that notion. But like I said, the fans were the real winners of this series and the real player of the series, if you will. And then on the other side, for Maryville, a little bit of an unfortunate series, but man, you went down swinging. You certainly can't complain that you didn't give it your best shot, because you absolutely made a lot of plays. It's just not all of them ended up working out. You ended up losing a lot of the team fights towards the back half half of these games, and that just ended up with a loss, and it's unfortunate, but man, you really did make it interesting, I'll say. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Odd Orange in the jungle. Not a great week for him, and honestly, it really hasn't been a great last 2 weeks for him. He was great to start the split. I think the first, 3 weeks of the split were actually really good from Odd Orange. He was a top 3 or 4 jungler in the NACL, in my opinion, in terms of just production, and that was really impressive, but I think a lot of the flaws are starting to be, shown through, I guess. He's not as good of a team fighter as I think some of the other junglers in this role. He's not going to be able to take over in the late game nearly as much, and oftentimes when he's put on tanks, I think this team does struggle to be able to generate leads in the early game, and that's definitely something that we're starting to figure out. It's not necessarily a knock against him, but certainly something to point out for Maryville. I think Zyko was also pretty poor this week and pretty poor in this series as well. I think the rest of this team was really interesting. I really like, in particular, how Niles was able to bounce back from what was a pretty rough day number 2 earlier this week, but for Maryville, this was an 0-6 week, and I know it doesn't necessarily, feel that way because this series was a lot of fun to watch, but it was an 0-6 week, which is just not what you want to see towards the back half of the split. That's basically disaster zone for this team. It's the worst thing that could happen, and so hopefully they're going to be able to turn it around because this was a team that really was looking really intriguing in the middle part of the split, and it feels like a lot of those intrigue moments have just kind of faded away. And then for Wildcard, this team is really good. They are intriguing, more so than basically any other, middle-tier team, I don't know how else to say it, middle-tier team in the NACL at the current moment. They're very, very fun to watch. They have a lot of different strategies, and especially if this bot lane can start stepping up to the level that this topside has been playing at throughout this split, this team is going to be very dangerous in the playoffs. And then we get another banger of a series, a really fun one here between Disguised and Cincinnati Fear that DSG is going to be able to take 2-0, although it was pretty close. There were moments in both of these games where Fear did look relatively good. Unfortunately, DSG was dominant today. This was the good performance from them. Sometimes they can be a little bit up and down, they can be a little bit inefficient, certainly inconsistent, but not in this series. They were really, really locked in here, and I think that it really showed the potential that this team has to be one of the best in the NACL. If everything were to continue to go according to plan. Really like what they were able to do. Player of the series for me is going to go to Meech. That means he was either player or dud of the series in every single one of DSG's series this week. And that just goes to show you, I think, where this team is at. When Meech pops off and just really plays out of his mind like he did in this series, this team's going to win. This team's going to be very, very difficult to beat because Meech really is that guy when he is able to play at that level. I think he's got the most amount of player of the series of anybody in the NACL. At the current moment for me, and that's pretty insane, considering the amount of talent in the NACL, but he's also got a ton of dud of the series. He's near the top of that as well, and so just a very volatile player that really matters a lot towards DSG's success overall, but in this series, he absolutely did step up, and he played incredibly well. It's hard to talk about Meech and not bring up Zeyzal in that same vein. I know Zeyzal is probably going to go a little bit under the radar because Meech is so flashy in terms of how he plays the game, but Zeyzal being able to dominate the laning phase and being able to generate leads early for DSG and for basically this map as a whole is a big reason that allows Meech to be able to play as aggressive and as dominant as he is able to do in the back half of the games like he did in this one. And so you got to give a lot of credit to Zeyzal. I know he's not really flying under the radar. Pretty much everybody knows he's a top 1 or top 2 support in the NACL at the current moment, but it is worth pointing out that I think Meech does get a lot of the credit for a lot of the really good things that DSG does, and Zeyzal I think is just as much a part of that as Meech is. And then Fake God had a really good series here. He continues to be awesome. He's going to have a couple of up and down games. I think that's just mostly top lane in the NACL at the current moment where you're going to have moments where you look good, you're going to have moments where you look bad, but Fake God for the most part has just been easily the best top laner in the NACL this split, and I don't even think that's really all that controversial. It's just been a lot of fun watching him re-find himself. He was really good last split on Cloud9 as well, which I think people tend to overlook. He was a big reason why that team did well in the regular season, and so to see him do well on DSG, it's not surprising for a Fake God believer like I've been basically my entire channel's history. So good stuff from DSG. They played well. And then poor Fear, I really do think they tried to put up a fight here, but it just wasn't going to be enough. This was not really a great performance from them. It felt like a lot of their best players were just a little bit outmatched in their particular roles. And there really wasn't a lot else to be able to pick up the slack in the back half of the game, which really did feel like kind of the crux of everything. Love the drafts coming in from Fear. I love the Zed. I love the Akshan. Really, really interesting, stuff coming in the mid lane. You know Shochi can play basically everything. He's done it at this point. He's played so many different champions in the NACL, but unfortunately it wasn't enough in this series. Dead of the series for me is going to go to Philip in the top lane. Fake God was just a lot better in this series, and I hate to be that guy because I honestly don't like tearing down players at all, and I'm not, I like to believe I am not tearing anybody down just by saying, I don't think Phillips had a great split, right? I don't know if it's him not being able to integrate himself as well with the rest of this team, but it sounds like comms are open. It sounds like vibes are good. And so I don't really know what it has been, but his laning has been significantly worse than it has been in the past. He was already a little bit of a step back, I would say, on FlyQuest last split, where it was just kind of okay, like certainly not great. Not awful, though. He definitely started to pick it up towards the back half of the split. But, you know, you go back a year, I mean, this dude was winning lane in the LCS, and now it feels like he's one of the weaker top laners in the NACL. It's definitely a little bit of a weird stretch. Hopefully he can turn it around. Obviously, he's got the skill to be able to do it. I just don't think it's been the perfect split for him. But JJ, I don't think was particularly great in this one. I don't think anybody was particularly great, if I'm being honest, for Fear. I think all of them had room to improve, but it's Disguise. It's CSG. It's one of the better teams in the league, and I think Fear is susceptible to potentially getting a little bit more skill checked than other teams in the league. We've talked about that, you know, with EG and with Wildcard in that same vein. Some of the teams that really do rely on just kind of being better than their opponents, I think Fear can definitely fall into that trap a couple of times, and that was just kind of the case in this one. DSG is a really, really good team, one near the top of the standings, and Fear shouldn't feel too hard done by the loss, but DSG is looking good. They're feeling good. This is the kind of series I need more. I know I say that so much about them on this channel, but if they can do this more frequently, I mean, what's to stop them from being top 1 in the NACL? And then moving on to the final series here of week number 5, and man, how do I even talk about this? It was Evil Geniuses challengers taking on FlyQuest challengers, and Evil Geniuses 2-0'd them, because of course they did. Why would we have expected anything else from these two teams? Fly had just started looking as good as they have looked at any point this split. Super consistent. UG and Spyrex in particular were looking phenomenal as a duo. The bot lane was really, really good in the previous series, and, you know, Faisal had been getting better and better and better every single series, and now they run into Evil Geniuses, a team that really hasn't been able to find any sort of consistency over the course of this year. So, of course, EG just absolutely wrecks them in this series. What is going on? Why does EG do this every single year? Like, their challengers team is just the funniest team to ever have to run into. They remind me so much of how I talk about, like, Weibo Gaming over in the LPL, where it's just like they will win every series that they're not supposed to and lose every series that they're supposed to win. And it's just absurd. There's no way to actually give them any sort of analysis in that way, but I'm going to go ahead and try because they did play really well in these games, and you got to give them a lot of credit for that. Player of the series for me is going to go to Ryoma. The dude carved up FlyQuest, and that's really, really important to say because, again, I know Ryoma gets a lot of hate in the community, not just obviously like in, you know, subsections surrounding like my channel or even things like that, but like you look at the Twitch chat in any of the EG Challengers games, you look at the post-match threads, the recaps on Reddit. People do not like Ryoma being in the NACL. People do not like him being on this Evil Geniuses team. And again, I can understand where they're coming from. Like, I get the idea behind not liking Ryoma on Evil Geniuses. I just don't know if I agree if he's going to play like this. Like, yes, he's super volatile, and he can be someone that can have really awful games while also having these really, really good games. But by all accounts, he's awesome off the rift to be a teammate for. Like, Tommy, as a person, has been nothing but a positive for pretty much everybody that he's played with, according to everybody that he's played with. And so I understand wanting to have a guy like that in comms and in the locker room, even if his performances can be rather up and down. And when you get ups like this, he just absolutely destroyed one of the top 2 teams in the league. Like, he was awesome in this series, and he deserves all the praise that he's going to get. So big credit to him. He was fantastic. Smoothie and King were really good. I think Smoothie actually had a really, really good series here going into Winsome, a matchup that I would have said was incredibly in favor of FlyQuest going into the series, Winsome and Masu, quite frankly. But, you know, King was really, really good in this series as well. He's been very consistently great for Evil Geniuses throughout this entire split. They really, really missed his presence, I would say, in the spring split. I actually do think if he was here in spring, that team would have been a lot better. But having him here now in summer, I think, is really a positive. And especially if Ryoma's going to step up and have really good performances like this against teams like FlyQuest. Like, if King's still going to be King and be arguably a top 1 or top 2 AD carry in the NACL like he has been over the course of this split, that's massive for EG. Smoothie had a good series. I'm not saying that that's going to be consistent at all because it really hasn't with him. You know, Shaden can be very inconsistent, but I like Surdy a lot on the top side. I think he's one of the more intriguing players in all of the NACL at the current moment. Someone who I've talked about previously having a ton of expectations for, not only this year, but moving forward. And I think EG could actually be a good team. But now that I've said that out loud, and now that I'm thinking this with the win, they're going to go right back to losing to the worst teams in the league. That's just what Evil Geniuses does. When you have no confidence in them, they start winning. And when you have a ton of confidence in them, they start losing. That's just what this team is going to continue to do. And then for FlyQuest, brutal loss here. You definitely did not want this to be the way that your week went. You looked so good. You were 4-0 going into the final day here, but to get this 0-2 is definitely a little bit frustrating. And honestly, bot lane just got outclassed. Like, there really is no other way to say it. Dud of the series is going to go to Winsome, but I think you could realistically give this to Masu as well. I think both played particularly poor going into their counterparts here, and that's not what I would have expected for FlyQuest going into this series, and especially going into this split. I really do think that Masu in particular has kind of not been what we thought he was going to be. We all thought it was just going to be automatic for him, and maybe the expectations were unfair, and looking back on it now, they probably were rather unfair, but the dude was so killer in spring, even on ping, that you go into summer and you're like, this guy's going to be a no-brainer number 180 carry. He's going to be in the LCS by next year, and it just hasn't necessarily panned out like that. He's been really good in a lot of their games, but he'll also have games like this where he goes into King and Smoothie's the best player in the laning phase, which is just not really what you would expect. But Winsome was also really, really bad. Again, when you play engagers, it really isn't going to work out if your team doesn't have any sort of pressure. And that's kind of the case with FlyQuest here. Winsome just wasn't able to get anything off, but I think the engages that he did get off were rather poor, and Winsome is somebody who I've praised a ton over the course of this split. I think he's probably been the best support in the NACL in 2023, and I think that it just wasn't necessarily the case here. And so, a couple of things to fix for FlyQuest, but what a win for Evil Geniuses. They've got to be incredibly excited. Hopefully they're going to be able to keep up this momentum, because this really is quite an astounding win to end off the week. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL week number 5 overview and analysis of all 3 days of action. Up on the screen now, that's going to be the updated NACL standings after 5 weeks. Any ties will, of course, just be broken alphabetically. No favoritism here, but any teams that are highlighted in green at the current moment have officially locked a playoff spot. You just need to be top 8 to lock playoffs. The top 4 have already locked it at the current moment. Of course, in the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week, so we can go over risers and fallers, but really, there's no changes, because everything played out just about as we expected this week. There really weren't a ton of surprises, and those surprises that did happen, I don't think deterred my thought process all too much. Top 4 is going to stay exactly the same, and they're all locked here. Team Liquid at 1, FlyQuest at 2, DSG at 3, Wildcard at 4. It's really how I feel about the teams at the current moment. FlyQuest in particular, I think after that loss to EG is definitely not an ideal situation, but they were so good before that it's hard not to cheer for them. And then DSG and Wildcard both feel like 3 and 4 at the current moment. Of course, Team Liquid going to stay at number 1, but all 4 of them have officially locked a playoff spot. And then Fear staying at 5, AoE staying at 6, both of them looking just about as good as I expected this week. And then Evil Geniuses, the one team to jump up. They're going to be moving up from number 8 to number 7. Pretty nice week for them overall. Hopefully they can sustain it. I don't want to overreact too much to their performance this week, because you never really know with this team, but easy to put them above a team like Maryville, who has just been kind of a disaster as of recent. I think if they were in this kind of form earlier on in the split, they would not be a top 8 team, but right now they had a very good middle of the split, and so they've probably put themselves in a good position. But Supernova and Taco are definitely on their heels. At the moment, still definitely 9 and 10, but Maryville, if they keep up this form, they're not safe by any stretch of the imagination, so something to keep in mind. But really not a lot of risers and fallers. But let me know what you guys think. Am I overrating or underrating any teams? Let me know down in the comments section below. Of course, it's time for Player of the Week and Dud of the Week here. In week number 5, my Player of the Week was actually kind of a difficult decision, but I did end up going with Yuji, the jungler for FlyQuest Challengers. Kind of insane that Yuji had not gotten a Player of the Week up until this point for me, because I really have been crazy high on what he's been able to do this split, but he's going to get it here in week number 5. He was awesome through their first 2 series. Both of those 2-0s were great at the beginning of the week. It's unfortunate they couldn't close it out with a win over Evil Geniuses, but still, Yuji, in my opinion, was the best player across this entire week, and might be the single best player in the NACL at the current moment in terms of performance and form, which is really good to say. Other player that I considered, Harry, was really the other major one. There were a couple of other nominees. I think Meech had to be mentioned, but his day 2 was not very good, and then Ryoma definitely had to be mentioned. I absolutely considered Ryoma, but at the end, I just settled on Yuji. I thought he was the most consistent throughout the week. And then Dud of the Week for me in week number 5. This one was also relatively easy. I ended up landing on Sketch, the AD carry for Supernova. Just not a very good week for Sketch. It really hasn't been a good run of form for Sketch overall, and for that Supernova bot lane just in general. Both him and Trevor I don't think have synergized as well as maybe we would have hoped, and I think they've kind of been a weakness for a Supernova team that is desperately trying to make top top 8. Obviously, none of the bottom 2 teams are eliminated by any means, especially with Maryville slumping as much as they currently are, but they're going to need to get their shit together if this team wants to be as good as they need to be to get to that top 8, and I think this bot lane has been a big reason for that. So my dud of the week in week number 5 is going to go to Sketch, and my player of the week is going to go to Yuji, but that is going to do it. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comments section below. One thing I do want to address on this channel, I posted a community post a little while ago, about over a week ago, notifying that I will be unavailable from the 14th to the 18th this week. And that is going to affect the NACL schedule for the upcoming weeks. It means I'm not going to be able to do the weekly recap for the final week of the NACL, and I really do apologize for that, but I'm going to be out of town, and I'm going to have to catch up. As you guys know, I don't only do the NACL on this channel, so I'm going to have to catch up on a bunch of regions, and unfortunately, the NACL just isn't going to be able to, I'm not going to be able to have time to watch the games in the final week, but I will be covering playoffs on this channel. Just a little bit of a heads up. I do apologize for missing the final week of the split. Kind of a bad time to end up missing it, but nothing can really be done about it. The schedule just doesn't end up landing in that department, but if you guys are interested in watching the rest of my content about the rest of the leagues, hit that subscribe button. I post about every single league on this channel, all 4 major regions, of course, as well as the NACL, mostly weekly, despite this week, weekly on this channel, and I really would appreciate if you guys hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live, especially if you enjoyed the content that I put out here today. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.